I think the only option left is to end the regime in North Korea by effectively having the South take it over. I think you've got to argue to China.
That's not really diplomatic, as far as they're concerned.
Well, that's their problem, not ours, because anybody who thinks that more diplomacy with North Korea or sanctions, whether against North Korea or an effort to apply sanctions against China, is just giving North Korea more time to increase its nuclear arsenal, increase its ballistic missile capability, increase the accuracy of its guidance systems, and put us, South Korea, and Japan in more jeopardy. We have fooled around with North Korea for 25 years, and fooling around some more is just going to make matters worse.
Yeah, just to put it in some historical perspective, you think back to the 1990s, 1994, Jimmy Carter going down there and basically coming up with this big solution alongside also President Clinton. And they thought they had taken care of this, which, by the way, another conversation for another day, should be a warning to all of us in terms of Iran. They didn't take care of it. 'Cause guess what? The North Koreans continue to work on their nuclear program. And now we are dealing with what, sir, today? Ambassador, describe the threat that North Korea presents to every American right now.
Well, they are very close. They're not there yet, I don't think, but they're very close to being able to hit targets all across the United States with, if today's test is a thermonuclear weapon, with thermonuclear weapons. Moreover, this regime will sell anything to anybody for hard currency. They could sell these weapons, ballistic missiles and the nuclear devices themselves, to Iran in a heartbeat. You may have noticed Iran's kind of flush with cash after the nuclear deal. So while we can focus on the Iran nuclear deal, it is the metaphor of the axis of evil is not really a metaphor. It's a reality. North Korea can sell these devices to terrorist groups around the world. They can be used as electromagnetic pulse weapons, that not necessarily hitting targets, but destroying our electrical grid's capabilities. They can be used for nuclear blackmail. And even further, not only could Iran get these weapons, it would be a lesson to every would-be nuclear state in the world that if you just have patience enough, you can wear the United States down. You know, the notion that we can accept North Korea or Iran with any kind of nuclear capability just means that we will forever be at their mercy.
Ambassador, what are we potentially risking, though, if we say, okay, we're going to go in with some strategic military strikes to take out his nuclear weapons, to possibly take him out or at least remove him from power? What is the risk? I mean, are we going to wind up with so many people's lives gone in South Korea, in Seoul, because we make that move?
Let me ask you this. How do you feel about dead Americans?
Yeah, no, I
mean,
I
look,
know
this
what you're
is
saying.
this is not this is not easy. This is not easy. But does anybody think the decision will be easier a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? This is the kind of thing we should heed Franklin Roosevelt's advice in a fireside chat in 1941 on September the 11th. Roosevelt said, "When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you don't wait until it has struck before you crush it." And he said, Nazi submarines and raiders are the rattlesnakes of the North Atlantic. I would argue that today, North Korean nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and Iran's, while we're on the subject, are the rattlesnakes of the 21st century. If you want to leave them there, there are going to be a lot of rattlesnakes in the world.
Listen, it is a shame that it ever got to this, but
it
you
absolutely
make an important
is.
point with Iran as well. Ambassador, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you.
There's a chance that we could end up having a major conflict with North Korea. Absolutely.
A major conflict with North Korea. Best-selling author and columnist Mark Steyn, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't think he's wrong. I was just listening to your previous discussion, Neil, and you know, when you talk about money and markets and taxes, you assume that wealth and power go together. You know, McDonald's is very wealthy, so it's also very powerful, whereas my chain of dead skunk burger restaurants isn't wealthy and so isn't powerful. And that yoke has fallen apart geopolitically. We have the wealthiest societies in human history, countries like Norway and New Zealand, that can't project power to their own borders. And we have basket case states like North Korea, which has an all but undetectable GDP, but it's a nuclear power. And that world is not going to endure in equilibrium for very long. Sooner or later, if North Korea's nuclear, if Sudan goes nuclear, if Yemen goes nuclear, and all the rich countries spend nothing defending themselves, the world will collapse. And that's what's at the heart of the North Korean question.
You know, I was talking to an analyst on this subject on Fox Business, which if you don't get, Mark, you really should demand. But one of the
I love it. I love it, Neil.
Indeed,
wouldn't miss it.
I did. But one of the things that came up, and quite seriously, it was a legitimate. Presidents of all stripes have dealt with you know, these North Korean dictators, whether it's this guy now, his dad, or the grandfather before that, and they all try to broker some sort of a deal or agreement where they look the other way, or they hope that some sanctions will, you know, tighten the noose around the leader's neck, and he'll see the wisdom and change. It never does. So here's President Trump coming along to say, all right, something's got to change. This is getting really crazy. You are getting dangerous. You're launching missiles with a frequency you've never seen before, and eventually you're going to get lucky. Now, we heard a tone, certainly out of the Secretary of State today, that is going to change. But we then have to change, right? We have to do something that is going to up the global ante and push us closer, right?
Yes, because I think if he has nuclear weapons, sooner or later he will use them. We all laugh because he's not very good. You know, he has one of his tests and the thing barely clears the perimeter fence, and we all laugh at him.
Right.
No, that's why he's dangerous. When you've got a nuclear power, you want the guy to be good at nuclear weapons, as broadly speaking, France and Russia and China and the United Kingdom and the United States are. When you have someone who isn't actually any good at it, then it's like watching an inebriated 93-year-old granny driving a 26-wheeler down the New Jersey Turnpike.
And you're also making the assumption that granny is going to be accountable or answerable to the policeman who might be chasing her. In this case, what if China can't control this guy, and we are playing the China card, hoping, praying they will?
Yeah, and I think that's actually the only form of leverage. I think Kim Jong-un is rational to the extent that he wants to stay alive. But he is not rational to the extent that if it were to suit him one particular evening, he would be perfectly happy to reduce Seoul or a Japanese city or any other city to a smoking ruin if it happened to suit what was in his head at that time. That world cannot continue, and so the Chinese have to be pressured to pressure North Korea into withdrawal. When you've only got 30 nuclear weapons, that's not like having hundreds and thousands. The fewer you have, the more likely you are to lose them, because it's use them or lose them. That's basically how it works at that level.
Amazing. All right, Mark Steyn, thank you very, very much. A best-selling author, columnist extraordinaire from his compound in New Hampshire, it looks like there. But, Mark, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Japan and South Korea all on edge. Here's ABC's Ian Pannell.
This nuclear test was so powerful it triggered an earthquake that shook buildings hundreds of miles away, from Russia to this in China.
Claim to have tested a hydrogen bomb said to be 10 times more powerful than the last one they tested, but they also claim they can now miniaturize it, and that is something that analysts thought would take them years to do. They've also claimed that they can put it on top an intercontinental ballistic missile, meaning potentially this could reach the US. Now, the test took place in the early hours of the morning, and They released images showing Kim Jong-un soon afterwards inspecting what they claim was this new hydrogen bomb. North Korea last carried out a nuclear test in September 2016. The test was carried out in the early hours at a test site in the north of the country, built deep inside the mountains. The secretive communist state said that this, its sixth nuclear test, was a, quote, perfect success. The explosion registered 6.3 on the Richter scale. That is almost 10 times more powerful than their last one. And it was so large that it caused a second earthquake. North Korea has repeatedly defied UN sanctions to develop nuclear weapons which could potentially reach the mainland US. U.S. sniffer planes have now been sent up to detect traces of radiation, and National Security Advisor General McMaster spoke to his South Korean counterpart about an hour after the test. And they will now consider deploying the most powerful U.S. tactical weapons and U.S. strategic military assets to the Korean peninsula. And of course, this comes just 4 days after President Trump tweeted that talking was no longer an option. It comes almost a month after President Trump said that any more provocation would be met with fire and fury. So now everyone waiting to see just how the U.S. administration is going to respond to this, and that will develop, of course, throughout the day.
And it seems like, Benjamin, they felt the need to wave their finger at us because of this last H-bomb test, which was allegedly underground. We didn't believe it, I guess, and he wanted now with all of these, that's where we're seeing all these state images coming out from the media from North Korea, right?
Yeah, that's right. It is very hard to verify anything that comes out of the rogue state. Of course, the security services will be poring over the pictures that they release, trying to get any evidence from that picture of a bomb to ascertain exactly what it is. But the scale of this alone suggests it is a new bomb, technology which they have not shown before. And of course, that is incredibly worrying, along with the fact that they claim they can miniaturize it. This is a game changer. And I think that, having seen sanctions not working, there's going to have to be another approach taken. And there's been condemnation from around the world, including most significantly China, which has come out and strongly condemned this as well. So, of course, they're going to have to get involved, and we will progress, follow this through the day, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Game changer. About the magnitude of that seismic activity, that explosion in northeastern North Korea. We're now hearing, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, that it was of a magnitude 6.3. That is an upgrade of the initial number of 5.2. We're now hearing that indeed it was a massive explosion of 6.3 on the Richter scale. We, of course, working to get more details, but we can tell you that the South Koreans and the USGS have all said that this was a man-made development, a man-made explosion. So in the past, when we've seen this, these earthquakes, this kind of seismic activity, it has been tied to nuclear tests. Let me just run through for you the 5 previous nuclear tests we've seen take place in North Korea. The first, in 2006, was estimated to be about a kiloton, just a fraction of the size of the bomb the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. The second test, in 2009, was bigger, 2 to 6 kilotons, according to the Arms Control Association. A third test followed in 2013. That was the first one carried out under leader Kim Jong-un. In January of last year, a fourth nuclear test. This time, the regime claiming it successfully detonated a hydrogen bomb. And then September 9th, 2016, a fifth nuclear test, and the most powerful one yet, estimated at 10 kilotons. Of course, right now, we don't have confirmation as to what exactly took place in northeastern North Korea, but the working assumption right now is that it was a nuclear test. We don't know the size of it. We don't know what kind of device.
South Korea says its President Moon will speak with Donald Trump about ways to deploy what he called the strongest strategic assets.
The South Korean president seems to be signaling that he's going to ask the United States to reintroduce U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, air-delivered smaller nuclear weapons onto the Korean peninsula.
Earlier this summer, North Korea proved it has missiles that could hit the U.S. mainland. Analysts concluding they've made a miniaturized warhead that can fit inside. Intelligence officials are worried the North is moving so fast it could have a nuclear-tipped missile capable of hitting the U.S. as early as next year. There are no good options of how to deal with it.
North Korea is one of the poorest and most reclusive countries in the world, but it has some impressive firepower. It conducted 2 nuclear tests in 2016 and 3 others since 2006. Experts guess that it has between 8 and around 20 warheads. The North also has thousands of rockets and artillery pieces aimed at Seoul, the South Korean capital. Its Taepodong-3 missile can put a satellite into orbit and has a range of more than 8,000 miles, enough to reach Los Angeles. And let's remember who we're dealing with. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, is a 30-something-year-old Swiss-educated son and grandson of North Korea's only 2 leaders since 1948. He has a reputation for iron-fisted rule and brutality. Reports by Human Rights Watch say he's imprisoned between 80,000 and 120,000 political opponents. He's executed several of his father's most trusted advisors. He blew one to bits with an anti-aircraft gun. And to say North Korea has been belligerent towards its neighbors is an understatement. It admitted to abducting Japanese citizens in the 1970s and 80s and is suspected in the disappearance of hundreds of others since the 1940s. It sunk a South Korean warship in 2010 and fired artillery shells at the south. North Korea often threatens to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. Earlier this year, it vowed to, quote, burn Manhattan down to ashes with a hydrogen bomb. All this might seem crazy, but North Korea watchers say there's a method to Kim Jong-un's madness. His main goal is to preserve his grip on power and prevent a foreign attack. North Korean threats to turn the United States into a fiery wasteland, for example, are always phrased as warnings of what North Korea would do if it were attacked first. China is North Korea's economic lifeline and chief political protector. So why doesn't it keep its hothead neighbor in line and force Kim from power? China wants to prevent a North Korean collapse that could trigger a flood of refugees across its border. And North Korea serves as a useful buffer between China and South Korea, where nearly 30,000 U.S. troops are stationed. Having an ally that's a thorn in the U.S. side.
And they have continued to advance more quickly than most analysts believed that they would, even as recently as just a few years ago. And so now you have yet another apparent nuclear test at the Punggye-ri nuclear test site, creating an explosion so powerful that it could be felt as an earthquake across the border in China. And you have North Korea defiantly saying that they're not worried about what China is going to do. They're not worried about what the United States is going to do, or Japan or South Korea. They are going to do what they see as necessary to protect their national sovereignty, and more importantly, for them to continue to have leverage over the rest of the world. And they essentially have created a scenario, Aisha, where even though the United States is far more wealthy and far more powerful, North Korea has something that the United States is going to be very hard-pressed to find a response to. Because all military analysts would say that a preemptive strike, a military option against a nuclear North Korea, would be far too dangerous for the country to accept. I mean, the humanitarian consequences would be catastrophic.
This is BBC World News. I'm Samantha Simmons. Our top stories. A strong earthquake has been detected in North Korea, raising speculation it may have carried out a 6th nuclear test. It follows claims from Kim Jong-un that the country had developed a new type of nuclear device. President Trump visits Texas and Louisiana to meet survivors of Hurricane Harvey. 500,000 households in the region have asked for help. In the past hour, seismologists have detected a powerful tremor in North Korea, prompting suggestions that Pyongyang may have carried out its 6th nuclear weapons test. The 6.3 magnitude tremor was described by Chinese and US experts as a suspected explosion. Earlier, the North said it had developed a powerful nuclear device small enough to be loaded onto an intercontinental missile. State media published a photograph of Kim Jong-un apparently inspecting such a device.
To defend ourselves and our allies, South Korea and Japan, from any attack, and our commitments among the allies are ironclad. Any threat to the United States or its territories, including Guam, or our allies, will be met with a massive military response, a response both effective and overwhelming. Kim Jong-un should take heed of the United Nations Security Council's unified voice. All members unanimously agreed on the threat North Korea poses, and they remain unanimous in their commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Because we are not looking to the total annihilation of a country, namely North Korea. But as I said, we have many options to do so. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
You are a subject matter expert as it pertains to North Korea and China. I asked you while they were speaking, are you surprised by this? Are you?
Yeah, I certainly am. I mean, I think that it was in Kim Jong-un's interest to try to keep the temperature as low as possible, because that way he could actually develop his missiles and his nukes, because you don't need to test all the time. He would be able to do that, keep the temperature low, the United States not paying any attention to him or paying little attention. And that would have meant in about a year's time, maybe even 9 months, he would have a fully developed capability. But he didn't do that, and now we've really forced to deal with this before he is able, I think, to put a nuke on a missile and to launch it at the United States.
You say the U.S. is forced to deal with this. What does that mean? What are we forced to do in your mind?
Well, I think that essentially, Secretary Tillerson, President Trump on the 22nd of last month, they were talking about how there was a pathway to peace and how the North Koreans were starting to respect us. Well, clearly we've been disrespected, and now, we have seen all sorts of missile tests, one over Japan last Tuesday. This is really serious for our allies and friends, and it challenges the credibility of the United States.
Very much so. This graphic behind us is a visual depiction of the 6 tests that they've conducted. You look at the first being a kiloton over a decade ago to last night's 120 kilotons, 10 times larger than the bomb they tested just a year ago.
Right, and that could do a lot of damage. This is psychological, of course, because the North Koreans are making very fast progress. One of the things that we need to be asking, and not only with nukes but also with missiles, they have to be getting help. The least likely explanation is that they're doing this on their own. We need to know who has been giving them the technical assistance, plus also the materials, as well as the diplomatic, economic, and money laundering support that's necessary to be able to do 120 kilotons.
Oh, it's a great point. We've got another map we're going to put up on the screen of North Korea and their testing sites. Obviously, of who may be helping them. Well, one of the countries that borders them is massive, with a great deal of technology, believed to be their client state in China. How responsible is China for this test, and will this finally, in any way, force them to put the screws to this regime?
The Chinese will be only forced to put the screws to the regime when we put the screws to China. China has been supplying semi-processed fissile material for the nuclear weapons program and some minor components and equipment. But for the ballistic missile program, China's help has been substantial.
Why has China been helping them?
Well, because every time North Korea does something provocative, we run to China and ask for their cooperation. We plead with them. We send a Secretary of State or some other high envoy. And that way, the Chinese are able to divert us from our talking about things that matter to us, like South China Sea, predatory trade practices, cyber attacks. We don't discuss those when we're talking about and obsessed with North Korea. So Beijing finds that, at least on a short term, this is very, very advantageous for them.
So do you think Beijing wants Kim Jong-un's regime to continue to pursue this, to be that sort of satellite agitator that prevents our ability to influence that region? Because once they've got that nuclear capability, there's almost a permanent blackmail over what the U.S. can do.
Well, certainly. And I think the Chinese, they have sort of an ambivalent attitude, but where it counts, at the top of the political system, with the Chinese military and with Xi Jinping, the ruler, I think that they find that this is good for them. Now, a lot of people, like in the foreign ministry and certainly in the policy-making community, they think that this is really bad for China in the long run. And they certainly are right, because China gets hurt more by North Korea if you think a decade, 2 decades down the road. But when it counts in, the next month or two, this is really good for the Chinese, as I mentioned.
Okay, if it's good for the Chinese, it's probably not good for us at this point. So if you've got an America First view of this, and you say, we're living under a potential blackmail scenario, sanctions haven't worked, UN resolutions haven't worked, maybe they're not strong enough sanctions at this point.
Certainly not strong enough.
We see these facilities here. Is there a point at which a preemptive strike or a shooting down of missiles is the next step for the U.S.?
Joining us now with reaction is Fox News contributor and former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. All right, good evening, Ambassador. It seems that we've never been closer to the brink of a nuclear war than we are right now. Is that a correct statement?
Well, I think we're at a crisis point, undoubtedly, because of the progress that North Korea has made on its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, particularly in the last 8 years. So Donald Trump inherits really 25 years of a failed policy of trying to negotiate North Korea out of these programs, and his options are few and not very good.
You know what's interesting, Ambassador, is the fact that the president, and he's been criticized for his rhetoric, but the president is making it very clear that he is prepared and ready, locked and loaded, to defend the American people and our territories as well. What's wrong with that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. You know, we've had 25 years of American politicians, Democrats and Republicans, standing up and saying solemnly, it is unacceptable for North Korea to have nuclear weapons. Same thing for Iran. Well, now we're being told by the same people who said we could negotiate North Korea out of these weapons, say basically, you know, I guess we've got to accept that that they're going to have nuclear weapons. Susan Rice wrote about it in the New York Times this morning on television. She said, I guess our policies failed. And now they're telling us we do have to accept it. I think that's not where Trump is, and that's not where we should be as a people. We should not allow ourselves to be held hostages by this erratic regime and the threat of nuclear terrorism against our country.
You know, without looking backward for too long, I mean, do you see the way that some of the administrations, particularly the Clinton administration, giving money to North Korea, and then the parallel of the Obama administration giving money to Iran? I mean, do you see that the appeasement that seems to be going on is only to our detriment, and that it is time for us to stand up, because these bullies are at the point where the Iranians yell death to America, death to the big devil, the little devil, Israel and the United States? I mean, what are we supposed to do, turn around and put our tail behind our legs?
Yeah, no, look, I think the legacy of policies over the past 25 years has been appeasement, and it's not the first time it's been called appeasement. Former Secretary of State Jim Baker, right after the Clinton administration signed the agreed framework, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that called the Clinton administration policy appeasement. That was 20 years ago. It hasn't worked. So unless you want to have a future where North Korea can threaten the United States with nuclear-tipped missiles, you have to look either at one more diplomatic play to convince China to reunite the peninsula with us in a constructive way and eliminate North Korea, or you have to look at the military option. People are worried about the difficulty, the chaos that might create today. The risk is real. What about the chaos when North Korea launches missiles at the United States?
Well, yeah, it's almost as though, and by the way, Kim Jong-un is putting a time period on it by the middle of August. But what's interesting is it's come out that there are back-channel negotiations that began with Otto Warmbier, the American university student who was sent home in a coma and died shortly thereafter, and Tillerson saying, you know, that we will always consider negotiation, even at the point that we're at right now. What option does America have right now?
Well, there is no option to negotiate with North Korea. We've tried it for 25 years. It's failed. Just cite, for those who believe in it, cite one piece of evidence to think it will succeed in year 26. I think that's why the president's inherited such an unhappy situation. I do think it's worth trying with China on an expedited basis to convince them it's in China's national interest.
How do we do that,
North
Ambassador?
Korea.
How do we convince China? I mean, the president has done everything, you know, privately and publicly, and China says, hey, look, if America strikes first, and there's a whole issue as to whether or not that makes us the aggressor if we're trying to defend ourselves, then the question is, I mean, you know, China says they're going to fight with North Korea against us.
Well, they also said that if we were retaliating against North Korea, they would stand aside. And that's a significant development. I think there's a chunk of Chinese decision makers who think North Korea is a pretty ugly piece of baggage. I think there's a deal that can satisfy China on reunification. It's a hard argument. I wish we had started it 10 years ago, but better late than never, because otherwise the American people have a choice. Live with a nuclear North Korea and the threats and nuclear bribery that will entail forever, or do what the politicians said. Do not accept a nuclear North Korea. That could well involve a military option of some sort.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.